Have you ever stood in a room full of people and felt completely, utterly invisible? Or worse, have you ever been the target of their laughter while your life was being stripped away piece by piece? This was the nightmare Ngozi Okoli was living. Her bank accounts were at zero, her locks had been changed, and now she stood in a packed courtroom without a single person by her side. Across the aisle, her husband, Chika Obasi, wasn't just winning, he was enjoying the sport of it. He pointed at her faded dress and mocked her to the judge, calling her a penniless ghost who wasn't worth the court's time. The gallery roared with laughter, and for a moment it looked like Ngozi would lose everything. But Chika made one fatal mistake. He mistook Ngozi's silence for a lack of power. He thought he had married a woman with no past and no backup. He was wrong. Because while Chika was busy playing the bully, a woman in the back row, calm, elegant, and dangerous, was waiting for her moment to stand up. You are about to witness the most clinical, savage dismantling of an arrogant man ever recorded in a court of law. This isn't just a divorce story. It's a masterclass in why you should never mistake a mother's silence for weakness. Before we begin, kindly subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how this touched you. Chika Obasi sat behind the mahogany defense table, his posture so relaxed it was almost horizontal. To him, this wasn't a court of law, it was a victory lap. He adjusted the cufflinks of his bespoke Italian suit, a deep navy silk that whispered of oil contracts and political favors, and caught his reflection in the polished surface of his expensive watch. Everything about Chika was designed to broadcast power, to remind everyone in the room that he was the predator and Ngozi was merely the prey he had grown bored of. He didn't look like a man going through a divorce. He looked like a king presiding over a banquet. He leaned over to his lead counsel, a man with a predatory grin and a reputation for cleaning up domestic inconveniences, and whispered something that made them both chuckle. The sound was sharp and jagged in the quiet room, cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. Chika didn't care for the decorum of the court. Why should he? In his mind, he had already bought the outcome. Every few minutes, Chika would intentionally shift his gaze toward Ngozi. He didn't look at her with anger or even regret. He looked at her with a chilling, clinical amusement. He wanted to see her break. He wanted to see the exact moment she realized that the 12 years she had spent building a life with him had been erased with a single signature on a frozen bank account. He took a slow, deliberate sip of water, his eyes never leaving her slumped shoulders. To Chika, Ngozi was a simple girl he had plucked from obscurity, a woman he had allowed to share his light until he decided it was time for her to sit in the dark. He had spent the last 6 months systematically dismantling her existence, canceling her credit cards, reclaiming the car he'd given her for her 30th birthday, and even poisoning their mutual friends with calculated lies. By the time they stepped into this courtroom, he had ensured she was a ghost of her former self. He felt a surge of adrenaline as the judge entered the room. He wasn't afraid of the law. To Chika Obasi, the law was just another asset he intended to acquire. He leaned back, crossed his legs, and waited for the judge to begin the final act of Ngozi's humiliation. He was certain the game was over and he had won. He had no idea that he had just walked into a trap of his own making. The judge, a man whose face seemed carved from old mahogany and years of cynicism, cleared his throat, the sound echoing like a gavel strike through the humid courtroom. He adjusted his spectacles and looked down from his elevated bench, his eyes landing on the empty chair beside Ngozi. To the judge, the law was a machine that required specific parts to function, and today a vital part was missing. "Mrs. Obasi," the judge began, his voice weary and impatient, "this is a high-stakes matrimonial proceeding involving significant assets and complex litigation. The court was informed at the last hearing that you would be seeking legal representation. Where is your counsel?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Ngozi felt the heat of 100 eyes on her back, the curious gallery, the whispering clerks, and the predatory gaze of Chika's legal team. She tried to stand, but her knees felt like water. Her fingers brushed against the rough fabric of her handbag, which contained nothing but a few crumpled notes and a bus ticket. "My lord," she started, her voice barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, forcing the words out through a dry throat. I do not have a lawyer." A low ripple of laughter broke out from Chika's side of the room. It wasn't a sudden burst, but a slow, cruel undulation of sound that signaled their absolute lack of respect for her position. Chika didn't even try to hide it. He leaned back, shaking his head with a smirk that said, "I told you so." "You do not have a lawyer?" the judge repeated, his brow furrowing. "This court cannot provide one for you in a civil matter of this nature. Do you understand the gravity of this? Your husband's team has submitted a 300-page brief challenging your right to any alimony or property. Without a lawyer to cross-examine their claims, you are essentially walking into a lion's den with your hands tied." Ngozi looked down at her hands. They were trembling. "I tried, my lord. I contacted 5 different firms, but—" She swallowed hard, her eyes stinging. "My accounts have been frozen for 3 months. I have no access to my savings. Every door I knocked on required a retainer I simply do not have." Chika's lawyer stood up then, adjusting his silk robes with an air of mock pity. "My lord, if I may, it is not that my client's wife is penniless. It is simply that she lacks the credibility to secure representation. Perhaps she should have spent less time on her hobbies and more time understanding the realities of her marriage." The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing Ngozi down into the hard wooden chair. She felt small, insignificant, and entirely disposable. The judge sighed, a long, drawn-out sound of disappointment. "Mrs. Obasi, if you cannot produce counsel by the end of this morning's session, I will have no choice but to allow the petitioner to proceed unopposed. You are effectively standing on the edge of a cliff, and you have no one to catch you." Chika leaned over to his lawyer and whispered loud enough for the first 2 rows to hear. "She's not just standing on a cliff, she's already falling." The clock on the courtroom wall clicked forward to 10 a.m., the mechanical sounds feeling like a countdown to Ngozi's execution. Chika didn't just want a legal victory, he wanted a public sacrifice. He turned in his chair, making eye contact with his entourage in the gallery, a group of yes-men and socialites who knew exactly which side of the bread was buttered. With a theatrical sigh, he pointed a manicured finger toward Ngozi's lap. "My lord," Chika said, his voice dripping with a mock sorrow that didn't reach his dancing eyes. "Look at her. She shows up to a high court in a dress that looks like it was salvaged from a roadside bale. Is this the woman who claims she contributed to the prestige of our estate? She looks more like the help than the mistress of the house." The ripple of laughter that followed wasn't just a sound, it was a wave of heat that crashed over Ngozi's shoulders. A woman in the second row, draped in expensive lace, leaned over to her friend and whispered loudly about low-class ambition, sparking a fresh round of giggles. The crowd, sensing the power dynamic had shifted entirely toward the bully, joined in the sport. To them, Ngozi wasn't a person, she was a punchline. Ngozi's hands were clamped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned a ghostly, bloodless white. She stared at the scratched wooden surface of the table, trying to blink back the tears that threatened to ruin her last shred of dignity. Every time a new chuckle erupted from the gallery, she felt herself shrinking, as if the very air in the room was being sucked out by their cruelty. Chika leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial stage whisper that carried perfectly to the judge's bench. "She's so desperate she probably couldn't even afford the transport fare here today. Look at her knuckles, my lord. She's holding on to that empty purse like it's a life raft. It's pathetic. We are wasting the court's time on a woman who has nothing to offer but her own poverty." The judge tapped his gavel, but the gesture was half-hearted, more formality than a defense of Ngozi's honor. The room felt smaller, the humidity more stifling. Ngozi felt the sting of 1,000 cuts, each laugh a reminder of how quickly the world turns its back on the fallen. She was the goat at the abattoir, just as Chika had intended. But as the laughter reached its peak, a sudden heavy silence began to spread from the very back of the room, a silence so cold and sharp that it began to swallow the mockery whole. The 10 a.m. laugh was about to be cut short by the only thing Chika Obasi hadn't prepared for, the truth. The laughter was at its peak, a jagged symphony of elitist scorn, when the heavy oak doors at the rear of the chamber didn't just open, they seemed to yield. A woman who had been sitting in the shadows of the final row stood up. She didn't shout. She didn't demand attention. She simply rose, and the effect was like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. One by one, the heads in the gallery turned. The snickering socialites fell silent, their mouths hanging open as if the air had been sucked from their lungs. This woman wore a suit of ivory silk that looked like it had been spun from moonlight and authority, her movements fluid and deliberate. She didn't look like a spectator. She looked like the person who owned the building. As she began to walk down the center aisle, the sound of her heels on the marble floor was rhythmic and lethal. Click, 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 sounding like the ticking of a clock that had just run out for Chika Obasi. The crowd parted instinctively. Those who had been mocking Ngozi moments ago now pulled their feet back, shrinking into their seats as the woman passed. She carried a leather briefcase that looked more like a weapon than an accessory, and her eyes, cold and sharp as industrial diamonds, were fixed directly on the judge. Chika's smirk didn't just fade, it curdled. He shifted in his seat, his brow furrowing as he tried to place the face. He knew power when he saw it. He spent his life chasing it. But this was a different kind of power. This was the kind of authority that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. Ngozi remained frozen, her white knuckles grip on her purse finally loosening as the familiar scent of sandalwood and expensive ink reached her. She didn't turn around. She didn't have to. She knew that walk. She knew that silence. The woman reached the front of the court, stopping exactly between Ngozi's empty table and Chika's crowded one. She didn't look at her daughter, and she didn't deign to look at Chika. She simply looked up at the judge, who was now leaning so far forward he was nearly falling off his bench. The silence in the room was now so absolute you could hear the distant hum of the air conditioner. The mockery was gone. The game had stopped. "My lord," the woman said, her voice a rich, low contralto that commanded every molecule of oxygen in the room. "I believe there was some concern regarding my daughter's lack of representation. I am here to rectify that oversight." Chika's lawyer scrambled to his feet, his face pale. And who exactly are you, madam? You can't just walk into a closed hearing and—" The woman turned her head slowly, a predatory glint in her eyes that made the seasoned lawyer stumble over his next word. "My name," she said, each syllable landing like a heavyweight punch, "is Deborah Ngu, and I suggest you sit down before you say something your malpractice insurance can't cover." The judge adjusted his glasses, his hands visibly trembling as he peered over the bench. The name Deborah Ngu didn't just ring a bell, it sounded a clarion call that shook the very foundations of the room. This wasn't just a mother appearing for her daughter. This was the Iron Queen of international litigation, a woman who had successfully argued cases before the International Criminal Court and dismantled corporate monopolies across 3 continents. "Mrs. Ngu," the judge stammered, his previous impatience replaced by a frantic, almost subservient respect. The court was not aware you were in the country, let alone involved in this matter." Deborah stepped forward, her presence so commanding that Chika's legal team instinctively moved their chairs back to give her space. She placed her leather briefcase on the table next to Ngozi, the same table that moments ago had been a symbol of Ngozi's isolation. Now it felt like the center of the universe. I have been in the country long enough to watch a man who built his fortune on the backs of my family's connections attempt to discard my daughter like a piece of refuse," Deborah said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a resonant metallic quality that seemed to vibrate the very wood of the witness stand. Chika's face had turned a sickly shade of gray. The arrogance that had sustained him for months was evaporating, replaced by a cold, drenching realization. He always knew Ngozi came from a good family, but she had been so humble, so eager to build a life on their own terms, that he had convinced himself her parents were merely comfortable retirees in a distant village. He never imagined that his quiet wife was the sole heir to the Ngu legal dynasty.
"For the record, my lord," Deborah continued, snapping open the silver latches of her briefcase with a sound like a gunshot, "I am appearing as lead counsel for Mrs. Ngozi Okoli, and I am not here to negotiate. I am here to conduct an audit of a marriage built on fraud, and to ensure that when this session ends, Mr. Obasi is left with exactly what he brought into this union, absolutely nothing." She finally turned her head and looked at Chika. It wasn't a look of anger. It was the look a scientist gives a specimen under a microscope before disposing of it. Chika tried to speak, to regain his bravado, but his throat had seized. The gallery, which had been a theater of mockery only minutes prior, was now so quiet that the sound of Deborah pulling a thick stack of blue-bound documents from her bag sounded like thunder. The Iron Queen had taken the floor, and the trial of Chika Obasi had truly begun. Deborah Onwo did not waste a second. She moved with the surgical precision of a woman who had spent decades cutting through the lies of men like Chika. Without a glance at the gallery, she reached into her folder and pulled out a series of documents stamped with the official seal of the central bank and a private forensic accounting firm. "My lord," Deborah's voice cut through the stagnant air of the courtroom, "the petitioner has spent months claiming that his businesses are failing and that he has no liquid assets to support my daughter. He has lied to this court, claiming a total net worth that wouldn't cover the cost of the watch he is currently wearing." She walked toward Chika's table. He tried to maintain his composure, but as she approached, he instinctively leaned away, his expensive silk suit suddenly feeling like a straitjacket. Deborah dropped a heavy, blue-bound ledger directly in front of him. The sound was like a thunderclap. "This," she said, her eyes boring into his, "is the trail of the hidden empire. While you are busy freezing Ngozi's grocery money, you are funneling millions through 3 shell companies, names I'm sure you recognize: Azure Heights Ltd, Obasi Global Holdings, and the most insulting one, Ngozi's Trust, a charity you used as a personal laundromat for your offshore kickbacks." The judge leaned forward, his eyes scanning the summary page Deborah handed to the bailiff. "The amount listed here," the judge whispered, his voice rising in shock, 98 million naira? 98,400,000 to be exact, my lord," she corrected, her tone cold as ice. "And that is just what he moved in the last 6 months. These records show a systematic siphoning of marital funds into a Dubai-based account. It wasn't just a divorce tactic. It was a criminal conspiracy to defraud my daughter of her legal rights. Mr. Obasi didn't just hide money. He stole it from the very woman who helped him build his reputation." Chika's lawyer scrambled to see the papers, his hands shaking so violently that he nearly dropped them. "My lord, these are private banking records. This is a violation of..." "It is a discovery of truth," Deborah snapped, silencing him instantly. She turned back to the judge, her expression as unyielding as a mountain. "We have the wire transfers, the signatures, and the logs of every login made from Mr. Obasi's private office. He told this court he was a man of modest means. These papers prove he is a man of significant fraud." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of Chika's crumbling world. The man who had been laughing at his wife's cheap dress was now staring at the evidence of a crime that could put him behind bars for a decade. The hunter had become the hunted, and the hidden empire was now a prison of his own making.
The judge's gaze shifted from the damning forensic reports to the man cowering behind the defense table. The air in the room had changed. The oxygen of arrogance that Chika had breathed for months was gone, replaced by the cold, thin atmosphere of a trap snapping shut. "Mr. Obasi," the judge said, his voice no longer weary but sharpened by a growing indignation, "since you have repeatedly claimed under oath that you are practically insolvent, you will take the stand to explain these discrepancies. Now." Chika stumbled toward the witness box, his legs feeling like lead. Gone was the kingly stride of the morning. He looked like a man walking toward a gallows he had built with his own hands. As he took his seat and placed his hand on the Bible, he didn't look at Ngozi. He couldn't. He looked at the floor, his face glistening with a fine sheen of cold sweat. Deborah Ngu didn't stay behind her table. She walked toward the witness box with the slow, deliberate grace of a panther. She didn't use notes. She didn't need them. "Mr. Obasi," she began, her voice a low, dangerous purr. "Just 10 minutes ago, your counsel argued that you were a man of modest means who could barely afford the maintenance on your own home. Is that correct?" "Yes," Chika croaked, his voice cracking. "And you signed an affidavit under penalty of perjury stating you had no offshore interests, correct?" I might have misunderstood the phrasing of the document," Chika stammered, his eyes darting toward his lawyer, who was currently staring at his own shoes in a sudden fit of professional detachment. Deborah smiled, but it was a cold, clinical expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Misunderstood. Let's help your understanding then. On the 14th of last month, while my daughter was being harassed by debt collectors you hired to haunt her, a transfer of 15 million naira was made from an account in your name to a luxury car dealership in Dubai. Was that a misunderstanding too?" "I don't recall that specific transaction," Chika gasped, the walls of the courtroom seeming to close in on him. "Perhaps the misunderstanding is that you forgot I have the digital handshake from your private IP address," Deborah countered, her voice rising just enough to command the entire room. "You didn't just hide money, Chika. You sat in this very court and looked his lordship in the eye and lied. You lied about your wealth, you lied about your poverty, and you lied about your character." "I was just trying to protect my future," Chika suddenly shouted, the outburst echoing through the stunned silence. The judge's gavel didn't just tap, it slammed. "Protect your future by committing a felony in my presence? You have just admitted to willful perjury, Mr. Obasi." Chika froze, the realization of what he had just confessed to hitting him like a physical blow. He had walked into the witness box to bury his wife, but under the relentless gaze of the Iron Queen, he had only succeeded in digging his own grave. The mockery was dead. The game was over. And as Chika looked up, he finally saw Ngozi, not the victim he had mocked, but a woman finally seeing her monster as the small, frightened man he truly was. The legal trap had already stripped Chika of his financial mask, but Deborah Ngu was not finished. She knew that to truly dismantle a man who traded on his reputation, she had to expose the rot in his soul. She reached into the final compartment of her briefcase and withdrew a sleek silver tablet along with a stack of high-resolution photographs. "My lord," Deborah said, her voice dropping to a tone of quiet, lethal solemnity. "Mr. Obasi has spent this trial painting my daughter as a woman who failed her marital duties, a woman who deserved to be cast out with nothing. But while he was busy orchestrating her poverty, he was financing a life of breathtaking depravity." She tapped the screen of the tablet, and the court's monitors flickered to life. The images that appeared were not of business meetings or oil contracts. They were time-stamped photos of Chika in high-end boutiques in Lagos, London, and Paris, not with Ngozi, but with a succession of younger women. In one photo, he was laughing as he draped a diamond necklace over the neck of a woman identified in the court documents as Blessing, a secretary at one of his shell companies. While Ngozi was using her last savings to pay for a taxi to this court, Deborah continued, her words falling like stones into a still pond, Mr. Obasi was paying for a 3-bedroom apartment in Lekki for his mistress. He wasn't just hiding assets from his wife, he was using marital funds to subsidize a second secret life. I have here the credit card statements, all paid from the joint account he claimed was empty, showing luxury hotel stays, international flights, and jewelry purchases totaling over 30 million naira. Chika buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking, but it wasn't with grief. It was the desperate shiver of a man who had run out of lies. The gallery, once a place of mockery, was now filled with a heavy, judgmental silence. The socialites who had laughed with Chika now pulled away, their expressions shifting to pure revulsion. The judge leaned forward, his face twisting into a mask of profound disgust. He looked at the photos of Chika's extravagant betrayals and then at Ngozi, who sat perfectly still, her face a portrait of quiet, dignified pain. The judge's pity for the unrepresented wife had vanished, replaced by a cold judicial fury toward the man in the witness box. "Mr. Obasi," the judge whispered, the quietness of his voice more terrifying than a shout. "You didn't just break your vows, you used this court as a stage for a cruel performance. You stood here and mocked a woman you were actively robbing to pay for your mistresses. I have seen enough." Deborah stood tall, her shadow lengthening across the courtroom floor. She had not just defended her daughter, she had exposed the monster in the suit. The ultimate betrayal was no longer a secret, and for Chika Obasi, the price of that exposure was about to become higher than he could ever pay. The judge did not wait for a closing statement. He didn't need one. He looked at Chika, who was now a slumped, hollowed-out version of the man who had swaggered into the room. Then he looked at Ngozi. For the first time that morning, the judge's voice was devoid of weariness. It was resonant with the weight of absolute justice. "This court has seen many things," the judge began, his gaze hard as flint. "But rarely have I witnessed such a calculated display of malice and deceit. Mr. Obasi, you used the sanctity of this institution to attempt a financial execution of your wife. You lied, you hid, and you mocked. But the law is not a weapon for bullies." The judge struck his gavel with a finality that made the windows rattle. "The court hereby orders an immediate freeze on all of the petitioner's local and international assets. All shell companies identified as hidden empires are to be placed under receivership. Furthermore, Mr. Obasi, you are to vacate the marital residence within 24 hours. You will leave with only your personal clothing, nothing else. The property, the luxury vehicles, and the liquidated value of your offshore accounts are hereby awarded to Mrs. Ngozi Okoli as part of a temporary settlement, pending criminal proceedings for your perjury." A collective gasp swept through the gallery. The socialites who had laughed at Ngozi's dress were now scrambling to delete her husband's number from their phones. Chika tried to stand, but his knees buckled and he sank back into the witness box, the very throne of his own destruction. Deborah Ngo reached out and finally placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of pity, but one of recognition. Ngozi stood up, her back straight, her white-knuckled grip gone. She no longer looked like a distressed victim. She looked like a woman who had walked through fire and found her heritage on the other side. As they walked toward the doors, the crowd parted in a dead, respectful silence. Chika's lawyer was already packing his bags, refusing to even look at his client. At the exit, Ngozi paused and turned back one last time. She didn't look at Chika with hatred. She looked at him with the calm indifference one has for a stranger. "You called me a penniless ghost, Chika," she said, her voice clear and steady, reaching every corner of the silent room. "You forgot that ghosts only haunt the places where they were killed. I'm not a ghost anymore. I'm the woman who survived you." Ngozi stepped out into the bright morning sun of Port Harcourt, the air finally smelling of freedom. Beside her, the Iron Queen smiled, a rare, proud expression. The daughter of Deborah Ngu had found her truth, and the world would never mistake her silence for weakness again.